Hi, everybody. Today is Saturday, September 6th, 2025, and our friend Mark Sleboda is back with us. Welcome back, Mark.
Emma, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Dialogue Works.
Yeah, if you want to read what Mark writes on his website, here is down below his name. You can find him on his, usually write once, twice a week. Mark, how is that working?
I have on Boosty. I have 3 pieces of exclusive content every week.
Great.
So several hours worth. Sanction. It's Boosty is a sanctions proof Patreon. That's why I use it. So if you really are a glutton for punishment and you want to suffer more of me, then follow me there. Subscribe to me there.
Yeah. And please subscribe and hit the like button to reach more people. And Mark, let's get started with the SCO summit, and after that we had the military parade in China. It was somehow huge. You look at the weapons, you look at the parade, it comparing to what we've seen in the United States. But here is the reaction coming from the Trump administration was somehow confusing. Donald Trump came out and said it's too late for India to come back to us. Then he said we've lost Russia and India to China, to deepest, darkest China. And here is, I think, you looking at Donald Trump. Here is what he said, Mark.
States, everything in the world would die. It's true. It's so powerful. It's so big, and I made it really big in the first 4 years. Then it started to degenerate with what this Biden administration.
Yeah, it's all the same story.
We
It's
would
all about
all
the
we
Biden
would all
administration.
die without Trump in the United States. That's
And he has somebody to to put his blame.
and they
It's
stand
Joe
around
Biden.
him
He's done. Yeah.
smiling as he says that, like what he's saying isn't the rantings of a madman, of a little literal emperor with no clothes. It's shocking. Um, this Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit at the presidential level uh, in China, in Tianjin, China, was definitely the most important geopolitical event of the week, and probably the most consequential such multilateral, multipolar aspirant summit in some time. So where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I mean, there's obviously some, shall we say, geopolitical overlap with BRICS, with BRICS Plus. But the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is first and foremost, it's Eurasia, right? Brazil is not a member. South Africa is not a member, right? It's focused on Eurasia, right? The founding members, Russia, China, and the Central Asian states, and then India and Pakistan have joined. Then they've got tiered membership with the dialogue partners and associate members and so forth. But there were 20 heads of state in China for this event. So another summit of the world without the West, right? Because it is an Asian century or a Eurasian century, that sort of thing. I mean, we've been told that repeatedly, right? And the Western media over the last decade has done a really good job at ignoring every BRICS and SCO summit that have happened, right? You struggled to find any mention of them, even like they weren't worth commenting on. The U.S. wasn't there, so I mean, how important could it be? I mean, that was the mentality, but they couldn't ignore this one. This one, everyone was watching, right? Even Donald Trump, and it was 2 events rolled into one in a few days' time because it was this SCO presidential summit in Tianjin in China, and then 2 days later was this in Beijing, was the 80th anniversary of the defeat of imperialist fascist Japan in World War II. and of course the celebration of China's outsized role and the cost that they paid into that. China being at war and having been invaded by Imperial Japan for years before anyone else joined that particular conflict, and China suffering some 30 million dead and atrocities committed by the Japanese on them that put even the Nazis' worst fantasies to shame. So very, very important day for them. So not only a display of China's military power as a deterrent on stage, which was important, but also, historical memory, which is increasingly, of course, being deliberately whitewashed from Western minds, as part of their propaganda narrative about the history of the world. At the SCO summit, part of what draws so much attention to it this time, of course, is the fact that there is still a war going on between NATO, between the US and the rest of NATO and the West, by the US's own admission, right? Marco Rubio, a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. And there have been attempts and claims, so many claims in the Western media over the last 3 years of how Putin is isolated, right, from the world. Yet here was the world, and there was no end of leaders lining up. This was a summit of the world without the West. And who was isolated? Well, it seemed to me like it was the US and the Europeans that were isolated. They were the ones not there. And no one was much missing them, I have to say. So there was that. But there was also Modi. And as part of the Trump administration's attempt to force Russia to end the conflict in Ukraine on American terms, despite the fact that Russia is winning on the battlefield, they have turned to having failed to crush the Russian economy with sanctions. They now seek a war against the rest of the world, a sanctions tariff war, to force them to stop trading with Russia. And the two biggest purchasers of Russian energy are China and India, and then Turkey and the EU. But we can't really sanction our own allies, I guess, not with even more tariffs than we're already giving them. So they have to be ignored, and the U.S. can't punitively punish China, because very quietly the U.S. just lost the trade war that they started with China, and they can't reopen that can of worms, right? Over the issues of rare earths and certain magnets that China produces that the U.S. doesn't produce, not in the quality and quantity needed by the U.S. military, by the U.S. high-tech industry. And that was leverage that China had over the U.S. And so Trump gave up on his tariffs war against China. And so now he's mad at Putin, but Putin is the real Teflon Don, right? I mean, he can't do anything to him. So he can't punish China. So what does he do? He punches Modi, right? Because Modi, he was seen as the weakest link there. But Modi and India, a rising great power, certainly a regional power, the subcontinent. There's a reason they call it that. The most populous country in the world is simply not going to take that. They're not going to. The U.S. cannot dictate who they can and cannot trade with. They are a sovereign and independent power, right? They're not a European vassal state. They're not some Pacific island that exists on U.S. sufferance. They're India. They were doing diplomacy, back when United States was, plains with the Native American teepees, cresting the plains grass. The India refused, and the U.S. put these punitive tariffs on India, and Trump has tried to call Modi 4 times at least in the past few weeks, at least according to reports in the Western media, and Modi's so furious that he refuses to pick up the phone. So that said, Modi goes to China despite geopolitical tensions between China and India, tensions that, it must be said, the U.S. did a great deal to deliberately provoke as part of their geopolitical strategy of turning India into the Ukraine for China, right? Turning them into proxies to be used to contain and almost certainly confront China. That's all been all the decades of ingratiating themselves to China, of luring India in that capacity, right? The whole creation of the word Indo-Pacific, right, to use in that context, has now been lost. And India had a "wow, that's what you look like with the mask off" moment with U.S. hegemony, and Modi went to China for the first time in 7 years. He didn't have to go. He could have sent a foreign minister. He went. And not only did he go, but then he very demonstratively took the hands, right? Walking hands held with Putin and Xi Jinping in China, and had this, really ice-breaking bilateral meetings as well with China, where Xi Jinping said, now is the time for the dragon to dance with the elephant, meaning that China and India need to recognize that there are bigger things at stake. They need to resolve their differences, let bygones be bygones, find common cause, and resist this, flailing, desperate U.S. hegemonic pressure, this desperate attempt to keep control of the world. And that is what the SCO summit was on display there. It was defiance of the West, of the world without the West, in a way that, previous summits just haven't seen, because there's this new context, right? Trump himself tweeted about it, right? Quite bitterly, quite seething. He first he made a comment about a sarcastic comment about the military parade in China, and he ended it. I won't read the whole thing, but he ended it with this obvious sarcasm. May President Xi and the wonderful people of China have a great and lasting day of celebration. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. Oh my God, the bitterness. He's sitting at home watching, and they're living rent-free in his head. That's just amazing. And then it went even further. And we had this social media post by Trump, where he posted a picture of Modi and Xi Jinping and Putin walking hand in hand together at the SCO summit. And he said, looks like we've lost India and Russia to deepest, darkest China. May they have a long and prosperous future together. Again, the seething. First of their deepest, darkest China. What kind of racist, colonialist, heart of darkness nonsense is that? Are you conflating U.S. imperial beliefs about Africa and China? Deepest, darkest China. What even is that? I don't know. But I mean, you forced India and Russia, right, into alliance with China, by your hegemonic hubris, right? And seeking to, against all realist international relations theory and strategy, rather than trying to divide and conquer or move against one, no, they tried to pressure and seek confrontation and conflict with all three at the same time. And yeah, this is the result. All right. And it didn't, Donald Trump has seen it come to fruition, and particularly under his lack of diplomacy with India. But this has been something that's been building for years. So it's nothing new. But I know that maybe the tariff sanctions on India were the straw that broke the camel's proverbial back in that regard. So this is the U.S. and Europe isolated. This is the world without them. And there was the symbolism, there was the show of unity and defiance, but there was actually some real concrete stuff, because I'm a realist, right? And yes, I'm all for the symbolism and the unity and the messaging, and that was all there. But where's the meat, right? I want to see geopolitical action out of these multilateral summits, if they're to be more than just photo and ops and talking shops, like ultimately Rio was, because nothing was really done in Rio. Maybe things were discussed, but there was nothing concrete coming out of that. This was different because there was the announcement of a new SCO development bank, right, that will run parallel to the BRICS development bank, which is a big part again of this alternate global financial architecture that the multipolar world is building to just do business outside of the West, outside of the dollar, right? That's part of that. So that was a big announcement, right? Banks aren't sexy, they're not military gear on display, they're not conflicts, right? But the truth is that money makes the world go round. And in that sense, there's a reason why the U.S., the Europeans have the IMF and the World Bank, and the role it's played in their financial control of the world, for decades now. Well, now that we'll have the BRICS Development Bank and the SCO Development Bank as shall we say, parallel institutions to those Western ones. But I think probably the biggest concrete wasn't even necessarily an SCO achievement, but part of the SCO, of course. It was a bilateral deal between Russia and China. The announcement of a deal being struck on the creation, finally, after a decade of negotiating it, of Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline, which is going to run from Western Siberia through Mongolia and into northeastern China. And the important thing about this, there's already the Power of Siberia 1, which draws from the gas fields in southeastern Siberia. But this new pipeline, which will add to the amount of energy Russia is supplying to China, again in defiance of the US here, quite obviously, is coming from the Yamal gas fields in northwestern Siberia. And the importance there is these are the fields that gas was sent to Europe. In fact, in particular, they're the fields where Nord Stream 1 and 2 were to be sourced from. So this is Russia closing the door on Europe, saying, all right, we're done with you. We want a reliable consumer. We want someone who's not going to be trying to, pressure us and influence and overthrow our government and everything else while we're doing business with them, and who is a reliable partner. And this gas is now going to go to China, and that's huge. It's I've always said pipelines, whether we're talking oil, whether we're talking gas, these are geopolitics in solid form, right? These are the arteries pumping the blood through the development of a multipolar world here, tying the two countries together. And I mean, look, the U.S. went to the extent they did to finally sever the energy relationship between Russia and Europe, and to allow no going back, to blow up the Nord Stream pipelines, right? That shows you how important they are. And now China's economy is already more competitive than the Europeans, right? The Europeans, facing rising energy costs, are deindustrializing, right? You don't have to take my word for it. The Western mainstream media is full of articles about deindustrializing Germany and the UK and France in such financial situations that they may need an IMF bailout because they're bankrupt. And now, on top of that, even more of that cheap natural gas that would have gone to them is now going to go to China instead. Cheap, reliable supply, something that cannot be interdicted at sea in the Straits of Malacca by any US or allied naval action. And it's now going to China and will make China that much more, their goods, that much more economically competitive than the Europeans. This is not a nail in the coffin of the European economies, right? Because all the nails have already been put in that coffin, right? That coffin is already 6 feet in the ground. What is happening now is that Xi Jinping and Putin are standing on top of that grave, looking down at that coffin, kicking dirt onto it. That's what this is. This is crushing for Europe. I know that they noticed this conference going on, but they're not talking about what this means economically for the future of Europe, right? And they should be, because this is a death knell for their geopolitical future. They were already an irrelevant and impotent, Western backwater, nothing more than vassal states of the U.S. But whatever hopes they might have had are now completely over. Russia closed that door, and without Russia's energy, they have to bid instead for 4 times more expensive American or Qatari LNG that can never quite meet those demands. And China now has more and more. And what's more is they're already talking, this will take a few years to build, of course, right? But they're already talking about then, once that is done, expanding the capacity of both Power of Siberia lines and turning China into an energy hub. And then for Eurasia, for specifically the Pacific, and piping gas potentially up to the Koreas, potentially down to Southeast Asia, even potentially around the corner to India, right? This is about so many connections being physically tied between the countries of Eurasia. And again, the US and Europe sitting in the cold on the outside of that. So I think it was an important day. And if you want to talk the military parade, being an ex-military guy, I have to say, I'm not one who's generally impressed by military parades. I don't get a hard on, from seeing the gear and that sort of thing, but that was a massive and impressive display, not only of Chinese military's discipline and unity, that for instance, put Trump's military parade marching to, just to shame. I mean, just not even in the same category, but the technology, the military technology that was on display there. There was an article in Foreign Policy, right? A premier U.S. foreign policy outlet, right? No friend to China, no friend to a multipolar world. There was a couple of articles there, but one in particular, and this is by Sam Rogovin at the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, and the headline is "China's military is now leading." And the subtitle there, Wednesday's parade proved the global military balance has irrevocably changed. And just the first paragraph there, if you'll indulge me, says it all. It is now widely accepted that the story Western countries once told themselves, their narrative about China's technological development, that it is a mere imitator of Western technology, that it steals intellectual property, its successes result from wasteful public subsidies, is inadequate. This story still has some elements of truth, but it is much less true than it used to be. Was it ever really true? I don't know. China is today an innovator and technological leader in robotics, electric vehicles, nuclear reactors, solar energy, drones, high-speed rail, and AI. Right? That just says it all right there, and that at a time when the U.S. and all of NATO and the collective West are being out militarily produced, 4 times over by Russia alone in the proxy conflict in Ukraine, much less the capacity and now it's admitted the innovation of China. The American century, if it wasn't clear, is over. They can no longer swing that military around, certainly not in China's and Russia's backyard anymore. And that was, shall we say, the military message. On one hand, the SCO summit was about unity and a new vision for a multipolar world order and global governance. But the message from the military parade to the U.S., to the seething, bitter Trump watching from the outside, was you can't push us around anymore. That era is over. This is, or if it's not our world now, then our world and your world are going our separate ways, and you can't impose on ours anymore.
Mark, I really believe that what has happened with China, with the case of China and their political attitude, as we watch it during the summit and in the military parade, it's a result in that it's an outcome of what has happened in Ukraine. I think nobody was even. I cannot imagine that China was able to achieve this sort of mindset without the Ukraine war and what has happened to some extent, what has happened in the Middle East with the case of Yemen. These are huge messages to the Chinese government, and they're not there to fight the United States. They're not there to attack anybody, but they're sending a solid message to Washington that they're prepared to defend themselves.
Yeah. Every event now, right, builds on the events prior to it, right? And we can already, I think, probably go back to certainly to the 2008 August war, right? The first NATO proxy conflict against Russia in Georgia, where the government had been overthrown and taken over by the U.S. neoliberal strongman Saakashvili. Very brief war, but a prelude, right, to Ukraine, right, to events that would play out very much the same way there a decade later. You could go back and take a look at Iraq, of course, the U.S. invasion there, and how badly that went for the U.S. and the upsetting of the geopolitical balance in the Middle East, the empowerment of Iran and the axis of resistance there with Saddam Hussein, a whatever you may think, a geopolitical check and balance on Iranian influence there, and how that didn't quite work out the way the neocons hoped it would or thought it would to their benefit. But all of these events now build on each other, and certainly what has been happening in Ukraine has geopolitical repercussions. Right, it is showcasing to the rest of the world U.S. weakness and vulnerability, right, militarily and economically, and above all, diplomatically, because as the U.S. attempts to pressure the rest of the world into following their line, right, no country outside of the West, right, participated in the U.S.'s existential economic war of sanctions that failed to destroy the Russian economy, largely because the rest of the world said no. And it's empowering everyone else now. And yeah, I think Russia has a unique geopolitical position and context to defy the United States. But let's be honest. They also have the political will in a way that not political will and capability in a way that not every country has, right? China certainly has the capability, but they may not necessarily have the political will. And they've got this frenemy, interconnected economies with the United States that, is problematic. Russia, doesn't. And they're not afraid to mix it up and to defend their interests forcibly if necessary. They don't go out looking for the conflict. They're not going into the U.S. backyard. And that must be said. China, all of this military on display, yet the Chinese military was last used, briefly against Vietnam in the 1970s? They haven't been throwing their military around the world, overthrowing this government, invading that country, and so forth. So the context of the two, or even the three military powers here, I think is important. Not only the size and power of those militaries, but what they're used and have been used for. And you're right. China's is mostly defensive, right? Defensive in their interests, right? Yes. Taiwan, but even the U.S. admits that Taiwan is part of China, right? It's their island. It is the U.S. deliberately stoking a separatist regime on the island and flooding it with weapons, right? We all know that their wink and a game with the one China policy was just simply meant to facilitate the exploit the Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War and everything like that. And that played real well for them now. But China and Russia are not going to let that happen to them again, right? That is not going to happen again. And so, the whole one China fiction has been left on the table. But the U.S. no longer has the military power to confront China off of China's own coast in the Taiwanese Straits, in the South China Sea, and have any realistic expectation of victory. They don't. The U.S. war games have borne that out in the recent years again and again and again. And they haven't given up that particular game. Although there are reports just out this week that the U.S. may be considering a major geopolitical policy shift of not seeking confrontation with China, again, in the Pacific off of China's own coast on the other side of the ocean, but instead is going to double down and, shall we say, retrench in the Western Hemisphere. That the reports coming out of Hegseth's Department of War, as it's now, Truth in Advertising, now
What's
being
that?
rebranded.
What's that?
Hey, give them credit. They're more honest. I said during the last administration that actually it was Blinken's State Department that was the real Department of War. And lo and behold, as the Biden administration left office, the New York Times actually admitted the same thing, that under Blinken, it was a Department of War. But during the Trump administration, Rubio doesn't even really have a job. Witkoff does have the job of Secretary of State. So the Department of War is now once again in the Pentagon, and that's, shall we say, some truth in advertising. So I can only applaud that, to be honest. I think it's calling a spade, and those are the brutally frank truthisms that come out of Trump. That you can in that way actually appreciate the narcissist in chief there. So there is that.
Mark, when we look at the United States, the behavior of the establishment, I don't believe at this particular moment, I don't believe that Donald Trump would be able to do anything with the foreign policy of the United States. It's the establishment, the deep state deciding about everything. And the mindset of the establishment in the case of Ukraine was to trap Russia in Ukraine, and which failed. They're destroying. After all, we have to consider that they have won in Europe because there is no connection between Russia and Germany, and they won it that way. They didn't want any sort of connection and pipeline, Nord Stream pipeline between the two countries. That was a win for them.
Sure, but it is. Geopolitical terms, absolutely.
Exactly. They came to Iran. They attacked Iran. Donald Trump thought that they can do something in the southern part of Russia. I really don't believe that Donald Trump, just for the sake of Israel, for the sake of Netanyahu, has decided to get along with Netanyahu's plan. He wanted to shake this whole situation with Russia, because with the sanction, with the tariffs on China, that didn't work. There has to be something bigger than that. It failed again. Yemen, the same thing. And right now, they're in Venezuela. The case of Venezuela is somehow some sort of ridiculous thing that is happening, in my opinion. Do you think that Venezuela is somehow related to the picture that I try to paint, or is something different, is related to Epstein, to domestic policy in the United States?
So Trump's envoy to Ukraine, right, his babysitter for Ukraine, former General Kellogg, gave an interview a couple of months back, 2 or 3 months back, where he admitted that there has been a geopolitical shift in the world, where once in the last couple of decades, the U.S. could deal with Russia and China and Iran all together, but separately. But now these countries and others are now cooperating to a degree, right? And pushed together by the U.S., it must be said, and strong enough now that the U.S. can't deal with all of them at the same time, right? And there was that frank admission. So, the U.S. said, all right, team U.S.-led Western global hegemony, we need to have a division of labor. We can't handle all of this on our own anymore. So Europe, Israel, you have to pick up some of the burden sharing, right? There has to be. So they said, look, we need to pivot. China's the real threat for us, and we have to be the one to pivot to deal with China. Every U.S. president has been trying to since Obama. No one's been able to succeed. They always get bogged down in events in the Middle East and now in Eastern Europe. or Western Eurasia. But we're set on this. So Europe, you need to take care of Russia, and we're going to dump that whole thing off on you and try to. We're not going to abandon. We're going to take a step back from that, right? You can handle that. And Israel, like you got to deal with Iran, right? We got to get out of the Middle East. You need to deal with them. We'll give you some backup. We'll give you all the bombs you need. You can do whatever you want to the Palestinians, right, in the time, but we're not going to get involved in a war with Iran for you. You got to take care of that yourself. All right, we'll drop a few bombs if you insist, but that's it. And we need to go deal with China. And the problem, of course, with that whole idea was Europe is not anywhere near capable of dealing with Russia alone in Ukraine or in broader terms. And the attempted decapitation strike against Iran did not go as well as obviously Netanyahu promised Trump. And Trump had to come in and drop a few bombs and declare victory and extricate Israel from that one, at least for the time being. I know there's talk about that particular conflict, being re-sparked by Israel. But here, the U.S. Trump tried to end the conflict in Ukraine on U.S. terms. They tried to bluff and bluster against Putin, and Putin wasn't having any of it. Biden tried regime change. He thought they could overthrow the Russian government with that sanctions war. It didn't work out that way. Trump tried.
Before going to the case of Ukraine, I want to remind you something that may your audience and yourself are not aware of what's going on domestically in Iran and the alternative of the government outside of Iran. Those people who are so much connected with the establishment in the United States and the Israeli government.
Sure.
When they talk about Russia and China, they call them dictatorship. These people would never have any sort of friendship and relationship with Russia and China. That would be huge if they come to power in Iran. I think the whole idea was that if Netanyahu can do something to change the whole calculation in the region.
There was a decision that, okay, so we couldn't take out Russia in Ukraine, but maybe Iran is the weakest link. Maybe we can take out Iran. That was obviously the intention. The decapitation strike was meant to do that. There was a belief that the Iranian people, or at least the majority of them, didn't support the Iranian government. That you just take out the top and the whole house will crumble. It didn't work out that way at all. It worked out the opposite. The majority there are discontents in Iran, right? There are ethnic minorities. There is the Azeri, the Baluchi, right? You got the U.S. has the Mujahideen calque sitting in Albania waiting to be unleashed, right? You've got all of this, but it didn't work out that way. So yes, if Iran had been taken out, right, that would have opened Russia's soft underbelly in the Caucasus, something they're still trying to work out with Armenia and Azerbaijan now, right? They're still trying to provoke and to poke there. But it would have also stopped huge energy supply to China, right? And they could redirect that energy. So yeah, they're looking for links. This is no longer just about one country. It's not about a conflict with Iran, about a conflict with Russia, about a conflict with China. This is a global conflict. We're sitting in this, right? In the future, we will look back on this and recognize that we're in maybe not the beginning. We're already several steps into. I don't think we're quite at the middle yet, but we're in the beginning middle of what will be called World War III, a war to determine the future global order. And it's a series of interrelated geopolitical conflicts already going back a few years, right? That just keep building on each other. And yeah, the U.S. recognizes that it's not just against one opponent anymore, that they're cooperating, right? That they've got a shared vision, an alternate vision together. And then, but that also provides weakness, right? If you can take out one weak link there, then, you may be able to finish off your opponent by going after that weak link. Russia wasn't the weak link. They went for Iran. Iran wasn't as weak as they thought they would. The U.S. has been promising to move against China. Looking across the Pacific, they're looking pretty buff over there. I don't know if we're up to that. Let's retrench. Let's pick on someone at home. We need someone to prey on. How about Venezuela? They've got large oil supplies there, right? I don't think that there's a lot more than that there. They feel the need to demonstrate they've shown weakness now, despite claiming victory everywhere. They've shown weakness in Ukraine. They've shown weakness in failing at the real goal of regime change in Iran, right? They're not. There's a recognition that they're just not in China's league that China's not in their league anymore. So they're now talking about retrenching in the Western Hemisphere. And look at Venezuela has the largest proven energy reserves in the world, right? Proven. Right? I think I'm still pretty sure that Siberia has more, just not all completely mapped out and proven, at least not publicly. But they identify once again Venezuela as a weak government, and it's in their hemisphere, right? So they feel perfectly justified, and they're obviously starting to provoke something there. Now, I think they're probing. They're looking to see. Remember, the Trump administration tried a kind of keystone cop regime change effort against Venezuela in his first administration that was farcical and didn't go as planned. But I think that the Trump administration is like any other U.S. administration, right? It draws from largely the same ideological qualified pool of people in the deep state, right? The permanent bureaucracy, the blob. And the blob all wants war. Everyone wants war in support of hegemony against Russia and against China and against Iran. But those people, they're not all on the same page. It's not monolithic. They prioritize those conflicts differently, right? And what should happen first, what resources should be spent where, largely due to their own specialties, right? And there's a give and a tug, right? Obviously, during the Biden administration, the anti-Russian people, Victoria Nuland crew, crested to power, right? That didn't work out under the Trump administration, right? You started to see the pro-Israel, anti-Iran people crest to power. Well, that hasn't worked out either. And now they're looking around. What else we got? Do we have any anti-Venezuela people in the room? Right? Can we have you come to the front? Right? That feels like the people who specialize in the Western Hemisphere that have long been, shall we say, relegated to the back of the blob, the deep state room, right? But now they're being ushered forward, primarily because they're looking for an easy war, right? There aren't any easy wars left to win, but in comparison, I think Venezuela is, and there are reports, coming out where there's at some level, some of the people in the Trump administration, around Hegseth and others at least, are coming to this realization that they can't force the rest of the world, in China and Russia, in their own backyard anymore, and India now evidently too, now that they've lost India to deepest, darkest China, right? They're retrenching. They're circling the wagons in the Western Hemisphere, and I think that idea has been sold to Trump now. Trump always goes with, he's super sincere when he says something, and the next person he talks to 15 minutes later with his fluid conception of the truth, that becomes the new truth, right? And I think someone has convinced him that he needs to show strength and that Venezuela is some type of weak link that they can unleash their pent up, frustrated, predatory, instincts on. And that's what I don't get the feeling that this is terribly well thought through. It's very bad timing for it because Colombia has a leftist government now, right? That is not on board with that. In the prior Trump administration, that wasn't true, right? That
It's not just Colombia, Mexico, Brazil.
Mexico, bro. Yeah. So that makes it much more difficult for them. And Juan Guaido, when's the last you heard of the U.S., proxies for Venezuela? There isn't a big protest movement on the ground. I'm sure they've got people they can activate there, right? Just like Israel had people on the ground it could activate in Iran, lots of them, but not enough. And I think the same thing is the case there. I don't see any big color revolution in all of its requisite components for a proper one being put in motion, right? I don't see the buildup of opposition parties. I don't see, international justification being generated. I see this, let's go blow up a few drug boats and provoke in Venezuela into doing something stupid, right? And what? You're going to drop 4,000 Marines on the coast of Venezuela, and then what, right? Unless you've got an active, civil war on the ground going on, that's not going to be able to do anything. You can toss a few tomahawks in there, right, and blow some stuff up and declare victory, but what's that going to do ultimately? That's not going to change the government in Venezuela. I don't see any well thought through plan for regime change in Venezuela, which doesn't mean they can't stumble onto one and they can't still do significant damage lashing out. But all of this frankly smacks a little bit of desperation and frustration. And someone just sees Venezuela right now as the easiest one to take it out on, although maybe not as easy as they think.
I don't believe that Venezuela would be easy for the United States to go after at this particular moment. They're fighting each and everybody on this planet.
Yeah.
Mexico, Canada, just name it. Mark, what do you make of this picture? Gerasimov is talking, and and you look at the wall behind him. You see the map of Ukraine, and in this map, not only the 4 oblasts that Russia has already annexed to Russia. There you see Odessa, Nikolaev going up to Kharkov. What is that? Is that
Okay.
some sort of pressure? Is that real?
Okay.
What do you make of it?
So this was a map of southern Ukraine that was on the wall and spotted, obviously intended to be seen. This was not an accident. Let's be clear about this. At a meeting of the Russian General Staff, an important one, where Gerasimov made a very detailed, the most detailed account of the SMO that we've gotten thus far, right? A lot of detail in there, a lot of information that was put out about where it's been and where it is now, and also probably where it's going. And so this was, again, it was intentional. Nima, are you familiar with the American sport of baseball?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really, to be perfectly honest, but I grew up, so I have a little bit there. But there's a couple of movies that showcase a a particular scene. One of them is the older movie, baseball movie, The Natural, and another one is a little later, the baseball comedy Major League. And there's a scene in both movies where the batter comes up to the plate, or in one case it's the field, but in The Natural. But anyway, and they're getting ready to take a swing at the ball, and they point to the sky, right? Telling the pitcher and everywhere else, that's where I'm going to hit that ball. That's where it's going, right? It is a kind of swagger, a bit of aspiration. You want to call it somewhere between trolling and the plan, right? That's where I see it. But this is where this was. This is, where, all of this diplomacy, pushed by the Trump administration has gone nowhere because they're unwilling to meet Russian terms. Zelensky continues to be an obstinate, delusional madman. The Europeans are also obstinate, delusional madmen, and beyond all reason, right? Merz and Kaya Kallas and Macron and Starmer and the works. And Russia's saying, okay, we're fed up with this. Obviously, we're not completely writing things off, but it's clear that the Russian government has now come to the conclusion that this is all going nowhere, and at the end of the day, it's just going to have to be settled on the battlefield, right? It's not what the Kremlin wanted, but that's where they're going. And they're like, and if you're going to force us to do this, then we're going to take more rather than less. And they're making clear that Odessa and Nikolaev, at the very least, remember, this is only a map of southern Ukraine. It doesn't show Kharkov and Chernigov or Sumy or Dnipro. This is right there. So I think this is it. I think this is Gerasimov coming up to the plate and going, yeah, Odessa. That's where we're going. That's the way I take it.
Yeah. It seems that Kaya Kallas would join Victoria Nuland at the Columbia University to teach history.
Yeah, she could teach military history. Obviously, the history of World War II, where Private Ryan was saved and the U.S. won the war and occupied Berlin and so forth, right? It's. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say it's shocking, because maybe it's not even shocking anymore, but a display of ignorance and delusion of years of ingrained propaganda. That, I mean, you kind of expect this of the Americans. They've been propagandized so much, and Europeans over time. But I mean, Kaya Kallas from the Baltics. I mean, one of the countries that fought alongside Nazi Germany and lost that war against the Soviet Union, was occupied by the Soviet Union, along with Finland. I mean, again, the Prime Minister of Finland, Stubb, just a week earlier, repeating the same kind of nonsense. Talking up how Finland came out of World War II after having lost on, fought on the side of Nazi Germany, and as a model to Ukraine. What? How you gave up territory and accept neutral status? Yeah, that's what Russia's all about. But I don't think that's really what you're arguing there. These people are ignorant of history, and they just. I really believe that they don't see it when they say it. That facts just are left out because they're inconvenient, and it doesn't fit with the narrative that they've constructed about history, about the modern day, about World War II, right? So that has results in people like the EU high foreign policy muckety muck Kaya Kallas claiming that, it's madness to think that the Soviet Union and China won World War II, except that it's not. I mean, it's not. It's certainly not with the Soviet Union. And, while China, wasn't alone in the defeat of Imperial Japan. They fought them longer than anyone else and suffered more than anyone else. And Putin exactly pointed out, if it hadn't been for China's role, right, then Japan could have opened the second front against Russia, against the Soviet Union. And then the whole thing might have worked out very differently. So to downplay, to in the West, completely ignore China's role, vital, outsized role, outsized suffering in the defeat of imperial fascist Japan is another obscene distortion. And it's not, it's intentional. It is an obscene distortion, a rewriting of history.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Mark, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thanks for having me, and I'll look forward to our next conversation.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
See you soon.